right, hello everyone, and welcome to day 2 of Swordsquatch 2020 Cybersquatch. My name is Tim, my pronouns are he and him, and I am one of the organizers of Swordsquatch this year. I'm going to close this curtain behind me so you can't see my dirty basement behind me, because we're all at our homes or in our basements or maybe watching from our local club. Welcome, and we're glad that you're here. So today, we have a couple of moderators. Besides myself, we have Alex Hanning and Sasha here to help this run smoothly. And they will both be making sure that we are getting your questions answered, dealing with anything that might pop up on the technical side, and otherwise keeping things running smoothly. And we thank them for their time. A couple of quick reminders. Everyone who joined the webinar should have seen our code of conduct. Thank you all for reading that and for following the code of conduct. A couple of quick reminders from that. Black Lives Matter. Be kind to each other. Please be patient with any technical difficulties. If you've failed to follow the code, I see a bunch of really nice people on here, but if anybody is not following the code of conduct, we're just going to kick you off the webcast. And I don't want to have to do that. So if you have any questions, if you need any help, use the comment box, the chat button for anything related to like things that aren't working in the webinar or anything like that, and we'll get those figured out. If you have questions for our instructor, please use the Q&A, and we will convey those over to him as needed. And so, with that, I would like to welcome Mr. Derek Steelbaron, who will be talking to us today about the cube. Please take it away.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this delightful Cybersquatch edition, Swordsquatch 2020. Thank you very much for the delightful introduction. Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about the cube, and the cube is, I don't think it's anything new. I don't think it's anything that is revolutionary in the world of fencing. I think there's a lot of people that have names for it, but we at the 1595 and my class here at the Lonan group in Seattle uses the cube as a method of talking about how to defend oneself and how to keep the hand still, and a way to build an understanding of how to move the sword tactically and to protect yourself and to stab other people. So we start to define the cube using geometry, really, interestingly enough. So you think about way back in one's geometry classes and prehistory, whenever that was, that you have multiple points, and anything over 2 points or anything over 1 point, and you have a plane. And then if you start connecting planes together, you can create shapes in 3 dimensions. And so that's what we're going to do with the cube. So I'm going to introduce you to a couple of marks, 8 of them to be precise, that are going to create the corners of our cube. And those 8 marks we're going to define as from an on guard position, and then we're going to go through and define all 8 of those marks. So we'll start with doing that now. So here I am in a very typical kind of fencing guard position. My hand is low and on the outside. My feet, if you can see them, are in your kind of typical crooked L stance. My heels aren't in alignment, knees lightly bent. Slightly bladed stance towards my opponent. I want to show that my front foot is straight along the line of fence. It's pointing at my opponent. Blade slightly inclined and pointed towards the opponent's face. So I don't have it directly towards them straight. I don't have it held out straight. I've kind of held it in what is actually going to be one of the corners of our cube. This is going to be Mark C. The naming convention for this is straight out of the 1595 handbook. So while you may have other definitions for this in your own practice, this is what I'm going to use for this presentation, just for consistency and to keep it clear. So let's start with Mark A first. Mark A first is going to be about temple height, and it's on the outside of the body. You can think about making this point right up here as the first point of our square. That's going to be Mark A. We're going to then traverse down to Mark B. Mark B is going to be diagonally directly opposite Mark A, and it's going to be the second point in our square. Mark C is straight over and creates the third point of our square, and then we have Mark D, which is again back up to temple height, over on the inside of the body and creates the fourth point in our square. So we've got a plane that creates a square closer to us. We can call that the defensive side of the cube. We can call it the nearer side of the cube. However you like to think about it in your head, it's the one that's closest to you. We have a mirror of that same square ahead of us, kind of projected out in 3 dimensions towards our opponent. And we're going to do those exact same marks, A, B, C, D, but now instead of the defensive or retreated mark A, we're going to extend the arm out, and that creates the offensive or extended mark A. And we can just keep our arm extended and go to the extended version of mark B, C, and D. And so you see how we've created a cube. We've got the extended D, we've got the D that's closer to us, we've got the C, mark C that's closer in the back side of the cube, mark C that's on the front side of the cube, mark B that's on the rear side of the cube, mark B that's on the front side of the cube, and again, mark A on the rear side, and mark A on the extended side. So we've created this cube that floats in front of us, and we define it by points that we create using the hilt of our weapon. So that's how you begin thinking about the cube and hopefully projecting it in your mind's eye out in front of you. So the next thing we're going to talk about is moving from mark to mark. So, you know, a lot of us are taught guards, a lot of us are taught hand positions in fencing, and moving from mark to mark, from position to position, from place to place. We do the exact same thing in the 1595. You're going to use the exact same thing to utilize the cube. And that's always going to be done a couple of things. I say dressing the lines in my outline, which if I don't know if it's available, I can make it available to anybody that needs it. But dressing the lines or keeping things nice and straight. And that's because every time a person moves from mark to mark in the cube, we want that to be in a straight line. So here I am in that guard position, and if I want to move over to mark B of the cube, I want to move in a straight line. And I want to move in a straight line, particularly from the guard point of view, not the point part of view, not the tip point of view. We don't want to be following the point. We don't want to be following the tip. We want to be moving the strong part of our weapon, the protected part of our hand. So if you're in the guard position, a straight line over to mark B of the cube. We want to move into a straight diagonal line. If I wanted to go up to mark A of the cube, you notice I made a straight diagonal line across my body. I tried to make that as direct and simple an action as possible. Here we are in mark A. If I want to go to mark B, or mark D, pardon me, you'll notice I kind of have to extend my arm a little bit so that I can keep it minimally rotational. I want to keep that transitions as straight as possible from each of the marks of the cube. From all 8 points of the cube, the 4 that are closer to the body and the 4 that are away from the body, we're still doing this in straight lines. So here I am in this guard position, down here in mark C of the cube. Say I wanted to go to the extended mark D of the cube. That's going to be a diagonally straight line from the position where my hand is now to that extended temple height position, kind of traversing through this imaginary 3-dimensional cube that's floating out in front of me. So you're always seeing that the lines that are being traversed are straight. We're not allowing ourselves to scoop. A lot of transitions sometimes come with a scooping action, particularly when you're talking about from a high to a high. Say we're going to mark A and we want to go to mark D. A lot of people kind of scoop around or have to fight with their quilling. We want to try and limit that as much as possible, moving straight lines through the cube. Next thing up in my outline is, well, what about the feet? You may well be asking yourself, and I'm so glad that you did ask. We are going to be doing some footwork in this seminar, and so while we've taken an opportunity to look at the hand and how it's going to be moving between the different marks of the cube, we're now going to take a moment to shift down and look at our feet. So we started here in this very simple guard position, and you can see that guard position. I can see it on my screen there. You've got a very simple kind of crooked L stance. My front foot is in line with my opponent on what we call the line of fence. It's the line that the majority of the action is going to be happening on. Back foot is just kind of about 45 degrees off the line of fence. But one thing I want to make sure to reiterate is that our heels are not in line. So we're not going to click our heels. If the heels get too much in line, like back when I was doing very classical sorts of fencing and you couldn't cross over, it didn't cross over much. The heels being in line wasn't a problem, but if the heels are in line, the tendency to kind of click your heels when you try and pass forward. So you don't want to do that. You want to leave your hips open and set, and you want to be down in a guard position that's very mobile and very adaptable to whatever those pressures are that are coming. So we're in that guard position. So I'm going to set my sword aside for a second so I can gesticulate wildly at my feet. So you see our front foot, and we have and our rear foot. That can be, if you're left-handed, it's still going to be the same. It's going to be a front foot, rear foot. We have two pieces of footwork that we're going to be using in the front foot. And I say footwork and underline that verbally or as much as I can, because I don't want this to be confused with leg work. This is work that the foot itself is going to do. So here we are in our guard stance, and the first thing, the pieces of footwork that we're going to be using, I call shifts, 1595 call shifts, and we borrow them pretty much from classical boxing, to be perfectly frank. And they do a lot for how the body is aligned, and they help us move the body quickly and efficiently, which is another kind of subheading to what we're talking about tonight, and that's using these marks of the cube and using the body in these foot shifts to increase our speed and increase our efficiency while decreasing the amount of movement that we're actually doing. So anyway, back to the feet. We're going to talk about our first shift. The first shift is an outward shift. That's what we call that. And so we're going to leave my heel on the ground, my front heel on the ground. I'm going to pick up my front toe and rotate it out about 45 degrees and set it down. Right? That is the forward shift. So I'm going to go back to the guard position, and I'm going to produce a forward shift. There we are. One of the things you'll notice is that we are nothing if we are not just a bundle of matchsticks held together with rubber bands. That is the human body, right? We have bones and muscles, and all of them are aligned, and all of them are connected to each other. You can't move one without, feeling movement of another, butterfly effect sort of thing. So here we are, just using the exact same thing to move our entire body. We're picking up our toe, rotating it out 45 degrees. You see that my left shoulder is kind of drawn forward, and when I set that down, my left shoulder is forward, my weight has shifted. I'm not 70 degrees or 70% on the front foot and 30% on the back. I'm keeping my weight still fairly neutral between, but the weight itself has changed the direction that it's pointing. And that happens because the hips are connected to the shoulders and are connected to the foot, so that when we pick up that toe and rotate it out, we're actually shifting the hips a bit, and we're shifting the shoulder, and that's allowing us to shift the kind of gravity of our stance about 45 degrees off. Now that we're again facing straight down our front foot on a new line of fence, or at least on a new line. Right? So the the outward shift. Boom. The next shift we're going to do also uses the front foot. It's called a forward shift, which is why I got it confused there a couple of seconds ago. And to do that, you're going to pick up the heel, and you're going to shift out using the ball of the foot as your pivot point. Or the toe as the pivot point, about 45 degrees, and you're going to set down. And you notice again that my body has moved off the line of fence because my hips are attached to my legs, because the hips are attached to the shoulders. The shoulders are also part of this. We're going to be moving ourselves off the line of fence with the forward shift, and that kind of carries the body marginally forward. If I do this from the side, you can see that as I do a forward shift, the body is actually going to have to shift forward. It's not a great redistribution of weight, but it is part and parcel of how the hips are going to be connected to this and how the hips are going to be moving with this. And the same thing with the outward shift. You're going to be seeing, the body does move. The whole body moves with this. You shouldn't try to isolate just these shifts without having the upper body involved. You want the entire body to move together in concert, and that's how that's going to increase our speed and efficacy. I've talked a lot about the front foot. There are going to be a couple of very simple back foot actions that I want everyone to sort of be aware of, that they're going to show up in this seminar. And the first one is going to be, the compass steps. So a lot of us are familiar with that, and I like to use my compass steps after I've used foot shifts. So if I've done a forward shift, for instance, we all know that we could just simply kind of drag that back foot along in the arc of a compass, as though we were the very same compass that we would have used to plot circles in geometry class. And that redistributes our weight. It redistributes the alignment that we're standing on, and it kind of readdresses ourselves to a different angle of attack or defense, depending on how that goes. So forward shift, you'll see that there'll be a couple of compasses that we'll throw in, and you see that all of a sudden now I'm facing 45 degrees off the line of fence on the inside. Second back foot piece of footwork that we'll focus on is the pass, and a lot of us are also familiar with this one. Again, I like to do it after a shift. So if I've used the outward shift to sort of open up the position of the hips, so the hips kind of directed over here, and I'm going to open up a gate, as it were, by shifting the forward foot. Now I can slide that back foot forward, and all of a sudden I'm in a refused stance. Put the left foot forward. I've covered distance. You can use this multiple ways and multiple places to do things that are good for both defense and offense. So the 4 pieces of footwork then we're gonna be using. We're gonna have the outward shift. We're gonna have the forward shift. We're gonna have the pass, and we're gonna have the compass. Right. So any questions about those steps and those foot actions? We can talk about them, but they should be fairly straightforward. There are a lot of different sword arts out there. Okay, sorry, just had to advance my notes. So now we're going to be using what I have in my heading here, the art of defense. How to defend yourself using these shifts and these hand actions that we've learned. And one of the things that I like to say, or that my master Chris likes to say, is that you are your own puppeteer. And what that helps kind of aid de memoire for me is that if the hand moves, the foot can move. If the foot moves, the hand can move. And if either of those things are moving, the whole body's involved. Because again, bundle of matchsticks held together with rubber band. Right? So we'll look at a very, very traditional sort of parry to bring this all home and hopefully make it make sense. If I'm standing in guard like this and I have an attack coming on the inside line, traditionally a lot of swordplay is going to have you do, whether it's a classical foil 4 or parry 1, something along those lines, you're going to stay straight where you're at. The hand is going to move over probably about 18 to 20 inches, and it's going to have to come all the way in line with the hip so that it can protect everything that's behind it, right? And then if the person deceives you and goes for a 1-2, and now they're coming on the outside line, you're going to move all the way back about another 18 inches, 20 inches, something like that. So it takes time. It also sort of turns the body, because we've done this, you know, back in the classical fencing days. We do this and we wouldn't want to disrupt the carriage. We wouldn't want to disrupt where our feet were. Using shifts and these ideas of the marks of the square really help us to do this faster. And why am I wanting to do this faster? Why am I wanting to do this any differently than I've done before? I think the real key here is, with historical fencing, we're going to be doing this with a sword that weighs about 2.5 pounds. And if you've got a foil, if you've got an épée, if you've got a sports saber that weighs about 1 pound, you can afford to be flashing your hand back and forth. It's not very tiring. It's a very quick action. But when you start dealing with swords that weigh about 1 kilo and you're dealing with it in one hand, you start to run out of steam pretty quick, and you start to run out of speed really quick. And these things weigh a lot. And we want to use that, not fight against it. So instead of dragging my hand all the way over about 18 inches to try and protect, you know, a cut on the inside line, I can shift and move my hand at the same time. So if I do that forward shift, I'm going to pick up my heel, rotate that out by about 45 degrees. And you see that even just doing that, I've moved my body farther behind my weapon. And if I take my arm and shift it very gently over to what would then be marked B of the cube, I'm now directly behind my weapon, as protected as I would be had I moved my hand 18 inches and not moved my foot. But I've only moved my hand maybe 8 inches. And I've done it in a quick time that has allowed me to move my body behind my weapon and move my weapon into position, as well as align where my body is pointing. I've built an alignment that allows me to take a lot of weight on this defensive position. And that's important, because if somebody's cutting in with a heavy sword, if we're wielding heavy swords, I want to be able to stop that cut. I don't want him to be able to cut through. I want him to be able to, I want them to stop. Right? And the same thing happens if, again, I've been deceived. Great, you know, deceive the parry on the inside line, and now let's say they're going to be cutting on the outside line. I can pick my toe up and shift out. Again, just swinging the hand over into mark C of the cube and lay it down. And again, here I am. My on guard and the whole weight of my body is directed toward that incoming attack. And that allows that attack to, or that allows me to offer a very strong wall of steel against that attack. It's not going to be easy to collapse. It's going to be very sturdy. And I've made it sturdy, not through strength of my arm, not through the wonder of amazingly protective gloves or anything along those lines, but simple body mechanics, simply allowing my body to the outside line as the attack's coming in. I can take quite a large impact here and not have to worry about being cut through or anything along those lines. We can make these shifts from most points in the cube. So if I'm here in mark A of the cube, and I've got an attack coming in on the inside line, again, forward shift, and all I really have to do is grab, kind of close my fingers on my sword, and all of a sudden I'm parrying that line with enough shock absorption to deal with what's coming, right? From here I can shift outwards and just grasp the hilt, and all of a sudden I can take a downward angle cut from the outside line very effectively. So we can do this, the same kind of shifting. And you notice, again, stillness of the hand was one of the things I mentioned that we were going to be talking about. You see that here I am protecting my inside line and just as easily shifting to protect my outside line, and I haven't moved my hand at all on its armature. All I've done is move the feet and allow the hips and legs and shoulders to shift and do what they're naturally going to do to keep myself aligned. So that's part of the ways that we're going to be using the hand. Again, as it says here, stillness of the hand, the minimal hand movement for maximum defense, right? And that's the idea that we're going for. In this guard position, attacks coming in, boom. I'm fast, I'm nimble, I'm strong, and I'm set to achieve what's coming. And I know where I need to go because I know I'm going to mark B of the cube, boom. I'm going to mark C of the cube, boom. I know I'm going to mark D of the cube, boom. I'm going to mark A of the cube, boom. And it's a straight line of the hand, and it's a simple shift of the foot. And as you were noticing there, I can string these together to do compound parries, basically, an attack against the compound attack. And it's very fast and it's very effective, and far more effective than kind of trying to chase a point with my arm and having to cover large amounts of distance. So we use this cube, which actually kind of becomes what we call a rectangle, because the cube now, it doesn't have to follow these big lines. All of a sudden now it's just a very small one. So it's very, very skinny, but very tall, the tallness of the torso. So we can hide behind our sword much better. We can align ourselves towards incoming attacks much better, and allow ourselves to receive those attacks and deal with those attacks very quickly, very nimbly, right? Just a quick review on using this against compound attack, for instance. I'm going to make a shift, forward shift, to cover my inside line, and if they did the old 1-2 on the feint on the inside, cut on the outside, I immediately, from that shifted position, from the position that my feet are in now, I just pick my toe up and rotate back out, using the body, using the hips, using the shoulders, and I'm just as covered on the outside line. I don't have to realign anything. I don't have to bring anything back to any guard position. I just make a couple of foot shifts and move my hand from mark to mark in the square, and I know that I'm protected. Advance my notes real quick. All right, so my next heading is D, all of the above, right? How is the concept of the cube and the concept of using these foot shifts and the idea of the efficiency that brings us, how is that useful to you, right? What can you take away from this seminar? You may not study with me, but you might be looking for some interesting ideas. What can you take away? And I think what you take away is a concept that I also mentioned in my outline, quantified intuition. And quantified intuition, for me, I read about this in an American fencing magazine years ago. And quantified intuition, what that means for me is this idea that you have very simple decision trees that you can follow to get very efficient maximal results. Because when there's chaos, which is what any kind of open vouting or any kind of fencing action is, basically just applying your science to the chaos and creating art, is when you've got chaos, simple is better. It's what's going to flash into your mind. If it is your go-to reaction, then you know you're safe and you know you're going to be okay if you have a panic reaction, and that panic reaction has been trained to be correct. And that's what we do when we study the science of fencing, is to follow these scientifically correct actions that we can then overlay on the chaos of a fight or a bout and create art, which is the art of fencing. So what can you take away? I'm going to say above and below decision making, which is another way of thinking about quantified intuition, a way of simplifying my decision trees. And the way I'm going to kind of construct that for us here is I'm going to teach you 2 quick parries. And I'm going to teach you some ripostes from those parries. And what those parries are designed to do is kind of cover a very wide range of incoming attack. And it makes it very simple for me, the defender, to know exactly what I need to do, kind of regardless of the the details of the attack that's coming in. So we're in the same guard position that I've been using. Blade angled across our body, hand down and mark C of the cube. Point actually and mark D of the cube, if you want to think about this in terms of kind of, you can have cube points on both ends of the sword and they'll move well together. But this idea that here we are in this nice straight, easy guard position. I've sort of bisected all of my available target. You've got target that is underneath my blade, which is going to be, you know, hips and flank and shoulder and side of the head, all kind of from the inside line. And then you have target that's above my blade or on the outside of my body, which is, you're going to be talking about again the head, but from the outside, shoulder, kind of outside flank, and even sort of outside leg, if you think about it. Right? If I've bisected that target area, I've given my opponent really two options. He can attack above my blade or below it, right? And I'm going to give you a quick little tool to be prepared for either of those two things. If the attack comes in under my blade, right, it's on the inside line. Inside line triggers in my mind, I need to do a forward shift. So the footwork piece of this parry is a forward shift, right? The nice handwork piece of the parry is simply leaving my hand in mark C of the cube and just dropping my point down to what would then kind of be mark B of the cube. So we've got this nice straight line that's basically shut down anything that's coming in underneath this guard position. Down, done. Whether it's a thrust, whether it's a cut, doesn't really matter. I make the shift and push down, and it's done. Right, I've ended it. The other thing would be that the attack comes on the outside. If the attack comes above my blade, right? That's going to be another simple matter. If it's coming from the outside, I think about outward shifts, right? Because I want to kind of turn into that cut. I'm adding weight against these incoming cuts, not retreating away from them, right? So if the cut's coming from the outside line or from above my blade, I'm just going to leave my hand again where it's at and turn into it, right? And that's going to cover a wider range of space. It's not going to be the ideal cover, right? Sometimes, you know, particularly on that outside line, if they're coming in very steep on the outside line, you might actually find yourself wanting to go to mark A of the cube instead of leaving your hand in mark C of the cube, right? But it makes just as much sense to do one as the other, right? You've got nice straight line up into a final position, mark A of the cube. You've done it with an outside shift. Same thing on the inside line. If I wanted to go high with my point low on the inside line, I could do a forward shift and make a nice straight line and put my hand up and mark D of the cube, right? In both cases, I'm protecting myself. But for simplifying this, this idea of quantified intuition, this idea of creating very simple decision trees that I can follow. If it's coming in under my blade, I make a forward shift and a parry 7. Boom, what we call a parry low 7. And leave my hand in mark C of the cube and just drop the blade and shut that attack down. If it comes above my blade, I'm just going to turn into it and kind of prepare with what's coming, because I know that I'm going to be throwing this steel up to block whatever's coming in that general direction, right? Those are two parries that simplify our decision-making process, make it so that we don't have to suffer from paralysis of analysis. A lot of times I would watch fencing students of mine in my 13 years of teaching sports fencing and however long teaching historical fencing these days. I would watch students know that they had a defensive tool in their toolbox to use, and I could just see them kind of clicking through the file catalog of which one they were going to use as the attack was developing and eventually hit them. Paralysis of analysis, right? I know too many ways to stop this incoming stimuli of the attack, and I can't decide which one I want to use. Well, we simplify those decision trees and we make it easy, and you can flash into a direct attack or a direct parry that you know is going to save you from most of the attacks that are coming your way, and then flash into a direct riposte. Speaking about ripostes,
quick question before you move on.
Of course.
Astrid had a question, which is, can you name some of the historical sources that use this cube system? And I think to add to that, you mentioned the 1595 handbook. Could you just talk briefly about, like, where is this sort of material coming from and so on?
Certainly. I probably should have done that when I was in my introduction, but I thought it was so well done. Yes, so some of the historical sources that use the idea of the cube, a lot of that's going to be pointing straight to Angelo's Cutlass Treaty. And that's going to be Royal Navy Cutlass Treaties. And I think he also wrote a different version that was picked up by the Army. And this is 17, if I recall, might be 18. But this idea of having marks in that were called out, you know, positions of the hand, and you would go straight there. I think much in the same way as kind of modern science can look at ancient metallurgy and go, oh wow, we've got wonderful harmonics and a lot of interesting rules that are used for good sword making. Peter Johnson has a lovely talk about this. They probably didn't think about them in that way. They probably just said, well, this sword works better than that sword, so I'm going to make more like this. So it's very difficult to find a, you know, ancient historical treatise is going to talk about this idea of the cube precisely as I'm disclosing it here. But it's a good way for us through a modern lens to look back at a lot of the constructions that we see in historical fencing manuals as we see them get built up. Right? And then quickly to address the add-on question there regarding 1595. So 1595 was started in 2002 by Chris Chatfield over in Brighton in the UK, and he was a disillusioned sports fencer and boxer who had broken his knee and decided he didn't want to continue taking the pounding that the sport approach to boxing was giving him, and long ago decided that he wasn't going to follow sports saber because it sort of kind of went off on a tangent and sort of does its own thing. And it started working with Sussex Rapier Society, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was called back then. Working through some of the early HEMA or rapier stuff. I'm not entirely sure the sources that they used in the SRS, but not being particularly happy with that himself, he started casting around at that point for some other options, something else to read. Found the work by Saviolo, about whom I think literally trillions of gallons of digital ink have been spilled over time, and probably real ink as well. But found Saviolo's book. Again, you know, he's an Englishman. He doesn't read any other languages. There weren't a lot of treaties available in 2002. I mean, I'm sure you could find them if you dug them up, but it was easier for him to find, you know, the printed work of Vincenzo Saviolo and read through it. And he was just bemused and puzzled, as a lot of people are, kind of trying to read through a lot of what Saviolo says about the way feet move and the way hands move and the way the body's trying to move. And he just kind of sat there and was puzzled by it, and kept banging his head against it. I think as a lot of these recreationist sorts do. I mean, the guys that start recreating historical treaties are really good guys at banging their heads at problems and trying to figure out how you can sort of make it work. And for him, and for the 1595 now, the answer was using the shifts and using the handwork that we saw, using shifts that we saw in kind of classical pugilistic boxing, because and they're never really written down in boxing manuals, frankly. Like it was the kind of thing he remembers. He tells the story of kind of being taught foot shifts for the first time in his boxing club, and it wasn't that his boxing coach took him aside and said, you need to work on this shift, and that's how you want things to work with your feet. It was one of the old hands at the boxing gym that drug him over and was like, yeah, I see you throwing punches and doing things like this, but if you throw a punch like this, you know, it'd be a lot faster, be a lot better. And just sort of kind of learning that way. When he thought about the footwork in that sense, it made a lot more sense to him, and that was why, you know, 1595 will often say that Saviolo is our springboard. He's the treatise that got Chris thinking about how to use a sword, and particularly at that time, sort of rebelliously using a very heavy sword in one hand and saying, all right, I'm not going to give myself any benefits of the doubt here. I'm going to use a sword that's heavy and hard to use and kind of annoying, and have to figure out how the body mechanics work, because once you see these kind of the DNA strands of the body mechanics and the way sword play sort of gets passed down, I think you start to see it in a lot of different places. You start to see it in the Angelo's treatises. You start to see it in the longsword treatises. You start to see it in, you know, modern boxing or Pentaquan or you know, Filipino martial arts, things like that, other weapon martial arts. You start to see that there are common threads about how bodies move and the way they move. And we've all been sort of groping around in the dark trying to figure out how to write about it in a way that makes sense. You know, since heck, the first the first sword manual, if not even earlier. So we can struggle to teach people how to do that. So that gives you a kind of nice understanding of where the 1595 is coming from when we decide to use this. We're not a group of individual, or a group that sticks to one individual treatise. We'll take good fencing advice from wherever it happens to come. We like the idea of using the Angelo system as presented because it is very simple. It's proven to be very effective. It was used by British sailors throughout the empire for a better part of the century, and obviously they held on to their empire somehow, and it wasn't always just guns. So we believe that the swordplay that they used was effective, and it certainly is easy to teach, and that gives everybody a very nice basis of understanding how to move and how to move the sword around, which then allows some of the more kind of fancy pants stuff, which you would see in Saviola in Saviola's actual book, to come through and make a little bit more sense after it's had kind of some explanation of kind of base level fencing. Because Saviola says in the book, he says he's writing to people who already know how to fence. So Saviola isn't addressing the ranked beginner. He's not addressing the individual that has picked up the sword for the first time. He's addressing a guy who already knows how to fence, but needs a couple of extra ideas or a couple of extra constructions that help make him more effective. And so, in Chris's building of the 1595 Club in the UK and Europe, he needed to find an easily accessible curriculum that built up a good fencing brain and built up a good understanding of how the sword moves and how the body needs to move, which led to a little bit of, or the focus on the Angelo cutlass drill, and then incorporating more footwork as we've seen from a kind of pugilistic style of boxing. I hope that answers the question. Alex, if anybody
I think that
still
covers
confused,
it really well. Yeah, no, that's fine.
Great. Okay, thanks, Astrid, for the question. Appreciate that. Right, where were we? We were talking about a couple of parries. So we were talking about a couple of simple, easy parries that would cover a large range of incoming attack stimuli, for lack of a better way of thinking about it, right? And those parries were over the forward shift, dropping the blade down, which we would call 7 in the 1595 system, but you see that I'm basically trying to keep this in terms of the cube, leaving my hand in that mark C of the cube. Conversely, we had what we would call a parry 2, which is basically just kind of leaving the hand where it is and using the body to carry that into the attack. And I will take a quick moment and talk a bit about how that parry works. A lot of parries, a lot of us have thought about parries in a sports fencing way, I'm sure, in our life. And that was, back to the old school, boom, right? I'm going to do this with a retreat. I'm going to open distance and put my blade in the way, and that's going to protect me because I've opened a distance with my opponent. And that's sort of taking weight away from that defense. This is a parry that puts weight towards the defense. In each case, I'm piling in on that attack. The attack is coming in, I'm piling in on it. Not really stuffing it in its infancy, not really smothering it or anything, but I am going to add weight to that defensive action instead of taking it away from that defensive action by moving backwards with my feet. So you'll notice that this is a parry system that uses that approach as opposed to a more distance type approach. All right, so we've made these two parries. Well, now what? We've made parries, and as a great Polish sabre once said, if you parry them, you must punish them. So we've got the parry, we've parried them. Now we have to punish them. So here we are in this nice low position. Our hand is down here in mark C of the cube, and I've done that forward shift. I've kind of aligned myself. I'm piled in on top of the attack. My the attacker's blade is somewhere underneath mine, basically just down, and then they're sort of extended, which allows me to bring in that back foot action of the compass and move myself up to offensive mark A of the cube, right? And I basically have just done a riposte by moving, again, my hilt straight to that position. I'm not thinking about cutting with the blade. I'm thinking about moving my hilt to the offensive version of mark A. I'm moving it close to my opponent and extending my arm while at the same time compassing out. And you'll see that I stayed behind my weapon. I'm now behind my weapon. I'm protected by my weapon, and my weapon is ascending it up into the opponent with the riposte. It's a very simple, quick riposte, and what I would call a closed riposte, or a riposte that kind of maintains contact with the opponent blade. Same thing on the outside line. Right, we would make this parry, and we would call to or keeping our hand in mark C of the cube and doing an outward shift that allows us to take on that incoming pressure. In delivering what I call a closed riposte, and I'll define that in just a second because I didn't already, but in delivering a closed riposte, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take my hand and move it straight to the offensive mark A of the cube for the pass forward. Boom. And that's a thrust, closing off a line, thrusting into my opponent with a riposte, right? Closed versus open ripostes are something that I use as a little aide de memoire for myself. Closed ripostes have a tendency to be thrusts or where you've got blade contact and you maintain it. Open ripostes have a tendency to be cuts or where you do not have blade contact throughout the entirety of the riposte. And that plays into kind of, if you look at my notes here, I'm looking at my notes, the this, then that school of stabbing one's opponent, right? I want to do this, then that, right? This, then that, right? This idea that I am parrying with the weapon, attacking my opponent's weapon with either a pressure or a glissement, a glide, an offhand beat, any of those actions. I'm attacking that weapon, opening my opportunity, opening the line that I'm going to use, and then I'm going to move the back foot again as my own puppeteer, crossing forward in a cut, going straight from the defensive mark C to the offensive mark C, right? That's an open riposte that comes from that low parry because it's not connected to my opponent. I'm basically going to open a line and hit it real quick, hit that opening with the cut instead of something more closed, where if my opponent were to start trying to push against into a compound or into a counter parry, I would have further stimulus. I would have further things to tell me what to do. And again, from an outside line perspective, I've got that nice closed. I've got my opponent's blade locked in right here, and then I'm going to just step in and move it in. That's the closed response. I can do an open response just as easily by doing an offhand beat, pressure, glissement, something along those lines, and I can cut either way. Right? So I can take that point C that I'm sitting in here, and I can continue to the extended point C for the cut. I can go to an extended point D, or pardon me, extended point B for a cut as I cross forward. Right? So that sort of makes sense, this idea that there's two quick, broadly defensive parries, each one allowing you to offer a closed response, something that maintains contact with the opponent's blade, or an open response, something that does not maintain contact with the opponent's blade. Right. The last thing here that I've got on this list for closed versus open is this idea of compounds. I'm not going to do too much into this because down this way lies a highly complicated madness, but the idea being that if I have closed down an incoming attack and I am in the process of offering a riposte and I see that that I'm about to get counter parried, I can just as easily change and go to a different point in the cube, making a different cut, basically cutting around or cutting over. I can do cavaciones, I can do line changes, I can make compound ripostes, basically using this very simple kind of decision-making tree that says, okay, we're here. Now I'm making it straight in. I can go in after having beaten the weapon and created that opening, or I can go in and then either feint to go to on purpose compound riposte, or if I'm doing open-eyed fencing and I see that my opponent is beginning to close down my riposte, I can move around it. Okay. All right. The last piece here in my little talk is going to be about using the above and below decision making for counteroffensive actions, or what I call the catcher's glove theory to stabbing one's opponent, or using punch parries, as my instructor Chris likes to call them. Right. And before I do that, I'm gonna bring in one last philosophical parting shot, and that's the idea that you can do four things in fencing. You can attack, you can defend, you can counterattack, and you can prepare. If you don't know what you're doing, you're likely preparing to get hit as opposed to preparing to hit the opponent. So this flowchart helps a person be aware at all moments in time of what they're doing and how they're choosing to do it. And you can think about each of those four components as taking up a tempo of fencing time. So an attack takes a tempo of fencing time, a defense takes a tempo of fencing time, counteroffense takes a tempo of fencing time, and preparation can take 1 or a dozen moments of fencing time, depending on how much you want to stand there. But it's important to know that in the this then that school of stabbing one's opponent, I'm moving, I'm attacking the weapon, and then I'm making some sort of a riposte, right? I'm this then that. I'm acting on my opponent's blade, doubling down on making sure that I have a strong platform from which, but it does take extra tempi, right? There are extra tempos, extra time, right? I'm down here, I've got to make that extra push. I've got to make that glissement or that glisse, and then come up into the cut. So that's 2 times, two moments, 2 claps, 2 beats to do this. Right? Counterattacks have to do it in 1. Right? We again get to be our own puppeteer. Our feet are going to move with our hand, and we're going to move into using punch parries, or what I call the catcher's glove school. And the most easily illustrative of that is if we're in this guard position, we see that coveted incoming descending inside cut. It's coming down right here, looking straight for my neck. Right? I can make that forward shift, which I would do because it's coming on the inside, and immediately throw my arm up and out to the offensive Mark D of the cube, catching with my spell or with my guard that incoming blade, punching into it, boom. And that action of punching into it is what carries this point forward and likely hits my opponent, because they're closing ground, I'm not opening ground. So here we are in like a middle distance situation where the person is coming towards me to offer an attack. I'm not going to move backwards and parry. I'm not going to try and keep distance with them. I'm going to allow them to close and then use that against them by catching their attack, punching into it, at the same time, ideally hitting them with my point. But I'm not thinking with the point. That's kind of the most important thing I can underline again and again and again in the seminar is you're not thinking with the point. I'm not thinking about trying to stab the guy. I'm thinking, oh, the cut's coming here. I need to catch it with my bell guard, with the guard of the weapon. Once I do that, once I use that straight line, again, that straight line motion, the tip, the edge of the blade takes care of itself. It does what it needs to do. And I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to try and drive it home. And the more I do try and drive it home, the less I'm going to think about moving the hilt. So again, we want to move the hilt. It's good in a weighted weapon to move the hilt. It's where that action is quickest, because it's the action that you can push and place. And the tip is just going to kind of do what it needs to do to keep you protected, or basically to carry your offensive forward at that point. Right? And you can do that exact same action against an attack coming, say, an ascending cut from the inside line by just, again, forward shift and extending out straight into it, catching with the point, boom, catching that, punching down into the attack, right? If it's coming on the outside line, again, it's coming on the outside line, so we think, oh, outward shift, boom, outward shift with an immediate straight line maneuver up to the offensive A mark, boom, we punched up into that incoming attack, placing our point on our opponent. They're probably not going to cut the closed line if we're standing in guard, but you could, if you were here, just as easily roll forward and do the exact same thing. So sort of the parting line here is the cube is a nice way to think about moving the hilt from mark to mark to mark to mark efficiently and quickly. And that's made even more efficient and quick by using shifts to place the body advantageously behind the blade as you move it from mark to mark. And you can use those tools to create a simplified decision tree that allows you to deal with a wide variety of incoming stimuli without being overwhelmed by the choices and decisions that you have, and allows you to offer good, strong responses in terms of a riposte after having made those parries. And that's kind of the underlying idea of what I was trying to bring across and show here in this seminar was take away to your own fencing the idea of simplifying your decision trees, right? You can attack, defend, counterattack, and prepare. Know what you're doing at all times. Which of those 4 things are you doing and why? right? Be able to answer that question. Think about how do you move from your guard positions in the most efficient way possible. You want to do them quickly and easily and amplified with the body and the hips and the shoulders and the feet, instead of hampered by or in spite of. Right? I'm not going to move my hand all over the place when I can move my body and my hand all over the place by making it stronger to move that way. Right? So that's at the core of a lot of the 1595's instructional pedagogy, and I hope I was able to give you all a nice glimpse into that. I think we're, yeah, look at that, right on about 52 minutes, brilliant. So we've got some time for questions and answers, and I'm basically willing to be as available as anyone wants me to be up until our moderators tell us that it is time to be moving on and say our final adieus. So go ahead and salute you all. Thank you very much for your kind attention. And I'll open the floor to questions that you can submit via text or chat to Alex, or if Alex wants to open up the phone lines, as it were, and have folks come in on voice, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, so while we're waiting for any of the participants to come up with any questions, I can fill in some time with a question. So could you just in sort of summary, go through the different guard positions and maybe with some stepping, and just so people can see it all together in a sort of just a sequence.
Certainly. Right. So here we are. We're in that kind of our basic on guard position, and if I'm gonna we're gonna think about these 8 positions of the cube, and I want to do those with foot shifts. So if I'm moving anywhere on the inside line, so if I'm moving to mark D or mark C of the, or mark B of the cube, pardon me, D or B, I'm going to do a forward shift or a forward shift. Right? If I'm moving anywhere on the outside, I'm going to do an outward shift. So outward shift, and the hand goes to mark A. If I'm here on the inside line and I need to go to where that guard position was, outward shift, and the hand shifts over to mark C of the cube. I'm standing in the guard and I want to do a compound parry. I'm going to go forward shift, hand comes over into mark B of the cube, outward shift, and hand immediately shifts over to mark C of the cube, right? Same thing if I'm up high. Inward shift, and or forward shift, pardon me, and my hand goes over to mark D, outward shift, and my hand shifts over to mark A. If I'm going to bring the back foot into this, because I'm going to be thinking of this in terms of riposte, right? I'm going to be carrying my body forward. So I'm going to be parry and riposte. So this idea that I'm going to shift over, here I am in mark C. I'm going to pass forward with the back foot and go to the extended mark A. Again, keeping a nice straight line. If I'm here and I want to parry on the inside line, I can parry here, forward shift over to mark B of the cube, throw in the compass of the back foot, and hand goes to the extended mark D of the cube on the riposte. Yeah. Does that catch what you're looking for?
Yeah, that sort of thing, just as a nice summary.
Yeah.
So Astrid has another question. One is, which is that sabers come in a lot of different unique shapes and curves. Yes. Have you found that this is more effective with some rather than others? And then perhaps to add to that, if this is a naval cutlass system, or I believe you were saying it does apply to other weapons as well.
Yes, excellent questions. Thank you. Yeah, there are loads of different types of sabers, and there are loads of different kinds of curved weapons, and there are loads of different kinds of straight weapons. Saviolo himself says that this is the basis of the military art, is what he says he's talking about when he's writing his book. And he is shown in the very, very few terrible woodcuts that are in that book. He's shown holding what most people would call like an Italian-style side sword. This idea, this system, works with any sword out there: single-handed sword, double-handed sword, polearm, whatever you've got. The basic mechanics of the body remain the same regardless of the tool. It's not about the weapon; it's about the body, right? I like using curved blades because I think they add an interesting dimension that you just don't get in a lot of straight blades. If you've got a very long straight blade and you're utilizing the idea of the cube, you find yourself basically just kind of playing the corners. That's what your life is. It's playing the corners and then finding those holes and thrusting out to take advantage of those holes in the opponent's defense. or if you can make it compound action. When you have a shorter curved weapon like a cutlass or a saber, you're able to use that curve to your advantage. You're able to move things a little farther because of the belly of that curve, and you're able to guide. I love my Tessac here because the counter guard loves to reach out and grab people's blades and not let go, which I very much enjoy. So in any kind of free play situation, when I can grab onto an opponent's blade and have it locked in my quillins or in my counter guard, and not able to move because I've use that strong part of my blade, I get a nice clean opportunity for riposte each time. So I believe strongly that it's not about particular weapon choice. You choose the weapon that speaks to you. You choose the weapon that you want to use. The art that you follow or the activity that you do is built more from the body, and so it's going to express itself in the weapon that you use. And you will notice that there are weapons that will have some strengths in some areas and some weaknesses in others. Another one of my favorite weapons is about 41 inches long, and it's a long sword in one hand. It's about 41 inches long, based on the A535 from the Wallace collection. It weighs a ton, and it's very long, and it's very hard to maneuver. So you just find yourself, again, playing those corners and stabbing at it when you see an opening. It's no less dynamic, really. It's not any less interesting, but it's like a different golf club in the bag. So yeah, this is great fun with curved weapons. The initial writing of Angelo's system was for the use of the naval cutlass, which at that time was sort of curvy. It was probably no more curvy than my Tessac here, which is not the most curvy sword. You can see some polar sabers that have some real hardcore curves on them. And it's not to say that you couldn't use those or that they wouldn't be useful, or that you wouldn't see strengths develop in places. But again, that's about tailoring your choice, your personal choice of the weapon, and having that express the system in a way that it's efficient and satisfying. So yeah, I think it's great that there's choice out there. If I were to pick the sword that I wanted to use the most, you're looking at it, right? It's got great hand protection, good, nice, strong quillins that are wide and can catch a lot of incoming attacks, and a not insignificant, but also not necessarily intense curve. Chris Chatfield himself is actually in love with the 1796 cavalry saber, light cavalry saber replica from Black Fencer. That's his new baby, and he's got it off what he calls the hilt doctor, who's putting in some good hand protection, so he doesn't have to worry about breaking his fingers, and some cross guards, because for some strange reason they stopped putting them on swords after about the 1700s, and I don't really know why, but I wish they'd put them back. By heavens, I like them a lot more with cross guards. So yeah, I hope that's enlightening there. Thank you very much for the question.
Well, following on from that one, if you were applying this with a sword that doesn't have a basket hilt, and well, we all recognize that basket hilt swords are the best swords.
They are the best swords. You're absolutely true. Yeah.
But assuming you didn't happen to have one, how much would you need to adapt this system at all? Or
a little bit, and only with regards to distance. I'm going to disappear off camera for just 1 second while I go grab my sword that doesn't have a basket hilt. There goes the phone. We'll have video back shortly.
Oops.
Please bear with our technical difficulties. Interestingly enough, had not a single thing at all to do with my cat, who's been running around saying hello. Ooh. Close up of the waistcoat. That's what you've always wanted. There we are. There's that. Huzzah! Right, there we are. So here we are, Albion Morozzo sword, right? So definitely just your straight up crossguard blade. When you come into these defensive positions, the idea of using the distance is a little bit more important. You're going to have to make sure that you are catching that cut on the forte of the blade. You can't catch it up here in the weak part of the blade, because it's going to allow the attack to cut through your parry, and that's just not going to be very effective. So you're going to have to be more careful about when you move, catching it right at the crux there, catching it right where the crossguard is to be protected. And if you didn't have a finger over the crossguard and you were using something like an arming sword, you're definitely catching it directly where that crossguard is and directly where that crossguard is. And when you do a punch parry, you kind of do so at your own peril. I think the less hand protection that comes with the sword, right, either means you buy better gloves or you become that much better with the distance and the timing of your parries. The mechanics of the parry don't change. The timing has to become much more perfect because you don't have the opportunity to just throw your completely protected basket hilted hand up into whatever's coming your direction and know that whatever happens, it's going to stop. You have to catch it more on the forte of the blade, above the crossguard if you're using an arming sword, or well into the forte if you're using something like a side sword. Same kind of situation comes in if you're using the old A535 here. When those parries come in, I want to keep a good angle, which is probably the most important thing, even with anything that doesn't have a full cup hilt or a full basket of handguard protection. Is you don't want to be meeting attacks straight on, because that opens up the ports of the weapon. That's how I got stabbed in the hand last year. That's how a lot of fingers get broken. When things get met straight on, you want to keep that angle because you're using the sword in its most effective way to create that shield. And you're using those crossguards and those quillins to do their job of stopping your opponent blade coming in. I don't think, I say it's not about the weapon, and you can kind of use whatever weapon you want. You just have to deal with the weaknesses and the strengths of that weapon. If you were to do this with Shashka, right, you could, but you better be really good at finding the opponent's blade with the forte of yours and being absolutely sure that you are moving your hands and your body in the correct way to be able to exercise leverage on your opponent without them basically just sliding off and cutting your hand. So yeah, it only changes in the precision necessary, Alex. So if you're a precise sort of person who doesn't mind running the risk of losing one's fingers, by all means, wear a light glove and an open hilted sword. Otherwise, be like the smarts people and use something that has a bell guard.
Nice.
Anything else? Any other questions?
We'll just wait and see if I haven't seen anyone else asking questions. So here's another one, as you're there. So probably by virtue of it being in the corner of a deck and for video purposes, you're not moving around much with the footwork. Is that a stylistic trait of being a naval thing, or is this something that when applied you're a lot more dynamic, or how would you describe the footwork when it's put into play?
Right. Yeah. Well said. I was going over this lesson this morning actually with Chris. We had a Zoom meeting earlier this morning, and we were kind of talking about those things. And he said that one of the important things to mention, and I forgot to mention it, which I'm glad you asked the question, so now I get a chance, is the idea that you don't just kind of stand there still. You want to do this in motion. Whether you're using curved sword, hand protection, no hand protection, either way. I am in a deck, I am in a corner, I'm not moving a whole lot as a result of that, but you would be able to find this a lot with a retreat and a shift, or with an advance and a shift, right? This idea that you're covering ground and you are moving along. He said the shifts and kind of the things that follow from shifts are probably about 30% of your fencing, which leaves a good 60-odd% of your fencing that is still just moving forward and backwards and distancing and creating those openings that you're going to use. The shift itself is a thing that you want to throw in at the moment that it's going to be the most useful. That being said, I like putting foot shifts with parries because it makes so much more sense to hide behind. But you don't just want to stand there and get attacked and have to parry. You are going to move. You mentioned the idea of this coming from a naval context, and that is interesting when you think about it. One of the things that I teach a lot of my students is be aware of gaining and losing ground, because again, and when we get this nice view from that naval tradition that says, if we're clearing the French off of what is soon to be one of our ships in the Napoleonic Wars, we want to do so as a unit of men. Right, so it's me shoulder and shoulder and shoulder with all the guys that have jumped over onto this French frigate. We're going to now push the Frenchies off the back end of the boat until it's ours now, right? And if I'm doing what kind of very dynamic fencing style, and I'm jumping backwards with a parry, I've left my shipmate up there completely exposed to take, kind of whatever punishment comes his direction. So there was definitely a sense that you were able to defend yourself with minimal use of the feet. We didn't talk about this defensive slip that I like to use, but the straight out of the Angelo Cutlass idea is this is as far back as you go, right? You don't actually move the back foot into a retreat at all. You don't move out of your place in line. If you need to move back to open space to take a parry, you pull your foot back, and that's as far as you go. So that now you've got to force yourself to go back forward. That changes, I think, the approach of folks fencing when they understand that I can do this nice slip and have moved my body back exactly the same as if I had done a retreat, only all of a sudden, instead of having to move my feet twice, I just have to move that front foot and I can then step forward or explode forward even with the riposte as necessary. So it is not a hallmark of the system necessarily, but it is something that you should use tactically and awarely, right? I would encourage folks to move using shifts, circles, passes, this whole idea of being able to put yourself in the correct position, and you'll find yourself using these foot shifts, and a lot of boxers, those kind of traditional boxers, are going to be using these foot shifts to deal with their opponents dancing around and their opponents placing themselves elsewhere in the ring. So it is a dynamic movement centered system, but be aware too that you should do so kind of tactically and with an awareness to the fact that you could be giving up ground that you might not want to give up. And for no better reason than instead of doing this, you might as well do this, right? To cover the inside line, or even, right, where I've got this opportunity to kind of, feint it, go in, and I can do all of that without having to move back foot, without having to dance around a whole lot. So yeah, the system as a whole doesn't discourage movements, particularly not at 1595, and particularly not in the Angelo system. There's plenty of advances and retreats to be found all around. Saviola doesn't talk a lot about lots of his movement, but I think a lot of his nuggets of wisdom are more in kind of taking a snapshot out of a more active footwork pattern and saying, all right, well, when this particular stimulus happens, bing, bang, boom, you win because you do this very simple action. That takes advantage of a weakness that you've either placed your opponent in or that your opponent has given you. Yeah.
So Astrid has another question, which is great because I don't have to ask all the questions.
Yay!
And the question is, does the system incorporate or address grappling in any way?
Yes, absolutely. As we call it in the 1595, we say the filth. Yeah, so again, it's not a sword fight, it's a fight with swords. And when you think about some of the way we've talked about the basics of footwork and some of the way that we've talked about how we're moving from different spots in the cube and how it is all recursively focused back onto the body as the beginning and ending of what we're practicing, this makes for an actually fairly effective unarmed practice as well. Not necessarily just the Angelo portion, but the idea that you can take the footwork from the Angelo portion, you can take these foot shifts, which actually come, we're probably best preserved. I'm sure you had foot shifts in a lot of martial arts throughout history. I've seen them in classical Japanese martial arts. I've seen them in modern sports boxing, right? I think boxing is probably the one that's kept it alive for the most people for the longest period of time. So obviously that's something that deals with grappling, and obviously something that deals with closing and what happens when the sword fight takes on a dimension that isn't just swords. But we can think about this idea that, if I'm parrying in that low parry that I was talking about, using this parry too, or staying in that position, mark C of a cube, right? I've stopped the steel, right? That's an excellent opportunity for me to shoot in. I've covered on the steel, I can shoot in, grab the opponent's arm, make an arm beat, make an action. I can also just, because I have opened my hips with this shift, beautiful opportunity for a nice fuete, right? Why not? Why wouldn't you? If the opponent only has one sword and he's attacking you, parry, fuete to the knee, come in with the riposte, right? And then once you're close, for instance, if we're going to be using kind of a shift, so boom, come up and protecting ourselves from diagonal descending cut on the inside line. Maybe they deceive it and are now cutting on the outside line. outward shift and I've caught them. They've continued to close. I get a great opportunity to step in. And as I step in, I can roll around the weapon. And I can either use the quillins to grab the arm, I can be around their arm, pulling it down, or because I've stepped in, excellent opportunity for a punch. And while I'm doing that step in, might as well chasson at the bottom while you're at it, right? I mean, if you've got their shins just sitting there, you might as well hit them. So incorporating what the body can do in entering into and finding your opponent's weaknesses and getting them to be extended and coming towards you, and then locking it out is definitely something that we address a lot in the 1595 kind of overall curriculum. It's not something that's great for free play, right? Because unless you have a very, very particular knowledge of the people that you're dealing with, we don't, we try not to drag it out at seminars. You don't see us doing that at WMAW, right? Or down in Malta, there's not a lot of the grappling that happens, even though you can get there. And it does show up in some of our in-club practices as people are more familiar with what's going on. But it's kind of the game that you want to play and sort of deciding what that is. But from the kind of martial arts sort of body mechanical awareness of what the body can do perspective, it certainly is something that is encouraged, incorporated, and utilized, I think, to its best advantage, because the basic conceit of the way the 1595 approaches pedagogy for swordsmanship is that it is about the body. So whether I'm carrying a sword or a pole arm or two swords or a dagger or two daggers or sword and dagger, sword and shield, am unarmed, what have you, the body mechanic remains the same. The general tactical approach remains the same. And that allows for a much easier flow of information so that you can begin to use the sword as kind of an integrated part of the system, the panache, to take something from the old French stick fighting, right? The idea that I don't just do it with the sword or with the stick. I have feet, I have extra hands. Why not use them? Yeah.
So given that we're mostly a lot of people stuck at home, solo drills to learn this sort of stuff.
Yes, great solo drills to learn kind of this stuff. To do this, to do solo drills to learn it, what you're going to think about doing is visualizing that cube in front of you, right? And at the basis, what you want to be able to do is very calmly and very, very cleanly move from point to point to point to point, from mark to mark to mark to mark in the cube. So we start in that guard position, and I want to think, all right, I've got two squares, A, B, C, D, extended A, B, C, D. And you want to think about, okay, you've got 8 points. How many lines can you draw between the 8 points of a cube, right? And you can just start working your way through that. Here I am, all right. I'm down here in mark C of the cube, closer to my body, which means I can go straight over into mark B. I can go forward into the extended version of C. I can go up into mark A. I can go over into mark D. I can go again diagonally forward into the extended mark D. I can go diagonally across and forward into the extended mark B, and I can shift forward into the forward part of mark C. And repeating that throughout, making it second nature to travel between each of the 8 marks on the cube in a straight line efficiently, and letting your arm and your wrist get used to that. One of the things I was telling a student recently is we all played with sticks when we were a kid. They were our swords, they were our rifles, they were everything that we played with when we, at least I did when I was a kid, running around the woods and beating up trees. And when you're a kid and you've got nothing but a broomstick in the yard to play with, you tend to kind of figure it out. Like your body sort of kind of is pliable enough that it sort of figures out how to move things well. And the second time you get whacked in the face for doing something dumb, you realize that you shouldn't do that, and you kind of begin to get better. And then secondary school comes along, and university, and then you're in a job and you don't play with sticks anymore. And then you're like, oh, okay, I'm going to do this fencing thing. I saw this online. I'm going to do this fencing thing. Wouldn't that be fun? And you pick up a stick again for like the first time in 20 years. And you kind of have to relearn how it feels in the hand, how it moves, and how it works. And so that's what that drill does. You just sit here and move from point to point, from position to position, right? And you begin to understand your body gets tired real fast because this is a 2.2 pound sword, right? This thing weighs almost a kilo, and you've only got so much shoulder, and you've only got so much arm muscle. So you learn, oh wait, the pommel's actually back here in the back somewhere. I'm using the whole of my body to support myself moving through the actions as I do from point to point and moving from point to point to point to point and stringing these actions together. Once you're comfortable moving your hand to all the different 8 points, then you start the idea of incorporating the feet using those 2 shifts that I was talking about. So anytime you are at a mark in the cube, moving towards a mark of the cube that's on the inside or underneath the weapon, forward shift, right? So now it's forward shift, extend, 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 extend. Outward shift if it's on the outside, right? So I'm in guard position and I'm here, and I'm outward shift, right? Outward shift, outward shift, outward shift. And I begin to build those associations that as the hand moves, the foot shifts, and as the hand moves in a straight line, the foot aligns the body or allows the hips and the shoulders to align the body behind where the blade is going. And you get nice compound actions. You'll have to kind of stop and reset every now and again, because if you keep dancing off with one foot doing shifts, you'll have to move the back foot a little bit, but that's fine, you can do that, right? So you go shift, 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 compass, right? And you can kind of move the feet together using just the footwork that we talked about, crosses, or passing forward, compass, and the shifts, both inside and forward, or outside and forward, pardon me. And then moving the hand through all those 8 positions, or 8 marks of the cube in a straight line. And you'll begin to get benefit from it. Your body will begin to understand that it can move from place to place to place, and you can see how it protects you. Whether you're lucky enough to have like a big full-length mirror that you can stand in front of and you kind of actually see your body moving behind the blade and getting closer to be behind the blade, and see how the shift in the shoulder happens, and feel the weight settle itself facing a different direction, and see how you're opening the hips and allowing them to move and setting up your retreats. You know, it's another nice one, is this idea that, you know, to do that forward shift, well, I've basically just created my exit strategy. I can compass and I make it an expanding compass and retreat my way out, or I can just compass and be offline from the direction of where my opponent is at that moment. And so you can kind of start building shadow boxing exercises around that plan, but definitely, you know, 2.5 minutes every day spent just moving the hand through all 8 points of the cube and trying to be mindful of when those shifts come in while you do it will help anybody's fencing, really, because you're just going to become that much more certain of where your hand is going and the path that your hand is going to take to get there, and the settling of the body behind where you're going to put the weapon.
Great. Well, I'm out of questions. I'm not.
I did it. I did it.
Yeah, you defeated me. Well, I could make up some more, but I think I covered a lot of ground.
We did. We covered an awful lot of stuff. And Astrid, thank you so much for asking really good questions.
I don't know if there's anything else that you want to mention about this, or if Tim wants to go to the wrap up. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I'm fine leaving it to popular vote. I can prattle on about swords until the cows come home. But, you know, I know you guys have got a show to run, so you don't want to sit here and listen to me jabber forever. But yeah, if there's any other questions or anything anybody wants to know about the 1595 loan in our practice here in Seattle, 1595 in Brighton or Europe, where we come from, why we think the way we think, where we're thinking we're going to go, swords to use, sword makers, I'm fine. Ask me questions or start conversations. Whatever works for folks.
Would you be willing to give us some background on the 1595 Club?
Certainly. So yeah, as I was saying before, it was founded in 2002 in Brighton in the UK. It was founded by Chris Chatfield. Chris Chatfield's a lifelong resident of Sussex, proud Sussexer. I forget what they're called. He was really unhappy when Meghan and Harry took over as his feudal overlords. There you go. A dissatisfied sports fencer. You know, in his younger days, he was taught sports saber, or at that point what you might call Olympic saber or classical style saber, from a community organizer type, and great guy, great guy from the stories Chris tells, and you know, basically pursued that for as long as he could. a lot of us, myself included, I say us, I think I talk about the sword community in general. I think a lot of people have tried the sport fencing route, and there is a lot of satisfaction to be had doing that, but there's also, I think some people come away from it with a little bit of a sense of emptiness, and I think Chris did as well, whether it was, dealing with the weirdness of the fact that there's a judge that has to call everything, and everything's so very ritualized, and there's a rule set that you're playing to. It's completely divorced from what most of us would consider reality to be. I think, leads to that high level of dissatisfaction. 2002 is also, right about the time, at least in my own experience, probably starting 95 to 2000 is probably this kind of initial big explosion of a lot of HEMA. I'm not saying it wasn't practiced before, but I think starting in the thousands, with the internet really coming into full force, you started seeing treatises being very easy to find. You started seeing people having discussions about this, and kind of getting on about it and building the world that we kind of inhabit now of various approaches and disciplines and a lot of different ideas. And so I think Chris navigated that as best he could by finding a group that was doing that sort of training locally, but still wasn't quite getting what he wanted, and so decided he would kind of do some reading on his own. Being an English speaker natively, as we said before, he found the Saviolo treatise and read that as kind of the thing that he had, that he could get to. If you ask Chris about it, he'll say that he really liked Saviolo's voice, the stories that he tells, kind of the philosophical approach of the guy. The actual step-by-step part of the fencing was mind-boggling and really required them to kind of spend, I would say, probably 2 years or so just beating his head against it to try and make it make sense for him. He said you kind of have to trust your teachers at some point, even if they are trying to trick you, as some of them would have, printed one thing in their book and then taught their students another, and then that sort of thing gone. But you have to trust the teacher, and you have to trust that the voice of the teacher is something that he reacted with. And I felt the same way. You read Saviolo's books, and he's got some really interesting stories to tell. He's a guy that went a lot of places and did a lot of things. And Chris found him a very excellent springboard for beginning a martial practice, and thinking about how do I work a sword best. So the 1595 in its current iteration is not a group that teaches Saviolo per se. It is a group that explores the art and science of fencing. And we define that art and science of fencing as saying the science of fencing is learning how to move well, and learning kind of the mathematical principles, if you will, behind how to move well. This idea of putting myself and aligning my body correctly and thinking about how I can cover various lines in a very efficient way, and taking that science and applying it to the chaos that happens when you're in a free play situation. And that interaction is what creates the art of fencing, because you're taking you're taking your shouldas and your rules and you're applying them to what is essentially pure chaos, and then what comes out in the end is hopefully something artful, because it's a taming of that chaos that expresses itself well. So that's what we shoot for. Not a very sporty club, the 1595. Have a tendency to focus a little bit more on heavier weapons because they're great teachers. They give us excellent feedback. If your body mechanics are off, a heavy weapon will tell you way before a 1-pound sports saber will tell you. Way before that ultralight rapier that you can buy from Castile or wherever your arm can get away with moving that thing around, quote unquote, wrong a long time before it gets tired. But when you're wielding something like this that weighs the better part of 3 pounds, a 2.2 pound curved sword, your body immediately tells you, hey, you're doing that wrong, and that means you get that feedback. Heavier weapons, we also believe philosophically, make people pay attention. When you're wielding a heavy weapon, you don't want to break anybody, or at least that's the hope, is you don't want to break anybody, and you don't want to be broken by anybody. And so that means we use it as a tool to make us focus on fencing well, because I think that's where for me anyway, in my approach, and a lot of the guys in the 1595 would say that the joy that they get out of it is the interplay of working for that touch, of applying that science to the chaos, and then seeing if we can create something artful, as opposed to just going in there and bashing away to get the touch or what have you. So I guess you could say it's a more martial approach and less of a sport approach. That's opens a lot of words that mean a lot of things. And so I think it's better to say that focusing on the actual act of the interplay of the two sensors is what's most important in the 1595. What we really try to make people do when they train with us is to make them think about how they're moving, to make them move well, in the hopes that what they create is something artful out of that application of science over chaos. There are, let's see here, there are SALs in Milan, Italy, Belgium, Brussels just opened up. We've got SALs in London, Brighton, and thanks to Lonan letting me set up shop and kind of inherit Nathan Barnett's 18th or 19th century class, we've got a little chapter here in Seattle as well. And we like to joke, taking over the world one little piece at a time. But yeah, Chris is a fairly well-regarded fella in European HEMA. I think the 1595 has a pretty good reputation over there. We really enjoy going to the Malta events because it's a lot of fun. Went to Roberto Gotti's events a couple of times at Geyer Thinks, and it was really great over there. And I've always had a really good opportunity to go meet and see and talk to folks. But kind of again, this idea of having a martial practice that is focused inherently on the use of the body as the tool, and then having the weapon be just sort of an ancillary extension of that is great, because it really opens up the books to expressing a lot of stuff. Chris is a little bit of a magpie every now and again. He'll get caught up on something, whether it's tomahawk or partisan or quarterstaff or cane, cane with a bit of savate, cane with a bit of boxing. Kind of all these things. Once you see those strings tying back to that basic biomechanical body movement that makes sense, you see it's so easy to say, oh yeah, you would use a chasson there, or yeah, you would throw a fouette, or yeah, you would come in for a hammer blow, or yeah, you could pass a parry chasse and then come in for a thrust or something like that. The idea of perching an incoming thrust out of the way, doing George Silver's the thrust is set aside with the strength of a child. And it's a beautiful expression, in my opinion, of the French boxe français, parry chasse. Just you kind of scooping it and pushing it out of the way, while at the same time kind of opening the opponent up to that returning line. So yeah, we'll take body mechanics, and we'll take actions from wherever they make sense, because to believe that somebody in the 1400s wrote the definitive manual of everything that a person could do to hurt another person is a little conceited, I think. And to believe that we haven't continued to grow and learn about how to bring our bodies together is in my opinion, more hopeful. To think that we can look back and see the value and unfold it into what we do now. So, and I think that view aligns with the overall 1595 kind of core set of values. I talk a lot about Angelo. I talk a lot about Saviolo. We use the Angelo system and the Angelo curriculum to build a good, solid, basic sensor, because it's not necessarily tied to cutlass or saber or whatever. Even though you'll see a lot of cutlasses, you'll see a lot of sabers, you'll see a lot of side swords in the 1595. The Angelo system builds a good, solid fencer with a good, solid fencing brain. And it's something that we've lost as a society. We don't walk around armed anymore to fence. I didn't learn how to fence, from my dad or my mom or the village swordmaster or whatever that situation be, right? I don't have that knowledge in me already. I had to learn it elsewhere. And so we look at the Angelo system and say, this builds really good, solid fencers from the ground up, and then we can overlay what Saviolo has to talk about and what other historical sources have to talk about, because a lot of them are related to each other, and a lot of them have things that make sense if you read them in other contexts. Saviolo himself says, I learned from like 5 guys, and I'm consolidating it down to this, and then I'm going to give it to you. Like this is my take on this thing. So this gadfly or this little magpie approach at wherever we can find actions that work, and using them for our benefit helps. But we have to have that basic understanding, and that's where that cube becomes very helpful, and those foot shifts, because they're so basic to the way the body has to move, and it makes you aware of where you're putting your weight and where you're putting your alignment. And the cube helps you be aware of where your hand can go and should go. If you limit it to those spots, you miss having this kind of weird uncommitted place that your hand can go to. While that may be a parry that saves you, it's not a committed place, so you might as well practice going to a committed place where your body knows where it is. One of the things I bring from my sports fencing coaching background is that the body is very dumb. It doesn't deal with ambiguity well. You have to show your body precisely what you're doing, and over again in order for it to reactively move correctly. Otherwise, it just gets kind of confused and doesn't know exactly what it needs to do. You have to build that awareness in, and studying with, a cube structure and with the foot shifts and the idea of where and how the attacks come in, and kind of building those proper reactions. That's what's going to kind of make the body work well under stress, which is sort of what we're trying to do, right? We're making an artful thing happen in a moment of chaos. So yeah, I hope that's a pretty deep dive into philosophy and the approach of how 1595 works with things like pedagogy and source material and just kind of general organization.
Thank you, Derek. I think that's an excellent summary to today's lesson. So yeah, thank you again for joining us today from
Smoky, Washington State.
So yes, thank you for the instruction today. Thank you to Alex and to Sasha for helping keeping things running smoothly. For those folks who are still online, please join any of our upcoming activities going through Sunday afternoon. Please especially drop into our Cyber Shindig tomorrow at 7 o'clock Pacific. Bring a beverage of choice. We would love to see your faces. And then maybe pop in and watch the D&D event after that. And with that, I would just like to say, if you had fun, please consider throwing us a donation. You can find us as Swordsquatch on PayPal. And a lot of that money we use to send to our home here in Seattle, Sanka, which, like many other small organizations, is undergoing lots of financial stress. So we would love to help keep them in business. And if you are in the US, please don't forget to vote this November. And with that, thank you all, and we hope to see you on a future Swordsquatch event.